The stars outside Outpost Crest 7 were always the same, cold, distant, still. Lena had counted them on her first night here. She had gotten to 43 before she stopped, not because she ran out of stars, because she started crying and could not see them anymore. That was 3 months ago. She did not cry anymore, she just watched. Tonight she was pressed against the cold observation window at the far end of Corridor 7, the one that nobody used after second shift because the heating panel was broken and the floor was always icy. She did not mind the cold. She had a blanket wrapped around her shoulders and her breath made small clouds on the glass. Below the window, 2 floors down, was the containment bay. And in the containment bay was the dragon. His name, according to the station files her father had left open on his desk, was listed as Subject Vreth 9. But Lena did not call him that, even in her head. She called him Drac, because that was the sound he made sometimes in the deep part of the night. Not a roar, not a growl, just a low, heavy sound like something very old and very tired letting out a breath it had been holding for years. He was enormous. That was the first thing anyone said about him. The second thing they said was that he was dangerous. The third thing they said, if they kept talking, was that the Galactic Union had captured him after a border conflict 3 sectors away, and that he had destroyed 2 patrol ships before they brought him down with a combined sedation charge that should have killed something half his size. He had survived it. That made people on the station nervous. Warden Nas, who ran station security with a tight jaw and tired eyes, had told Lena's father on their first day that no one was to approach the containment bay viewing level without clearance. He had looked directly at Lena when he said it. Lena had nodded. She had clearance now. She had asked her father for it, and he had given it to her because he knew she would find a way down there regardless, and he preferred she be registered on the system when she did. Dr. Owen was like that. He did not pretend his daughter was someone she was not. Outpost Crest 7 sat in orbit above a cold blue gas giant at the edge of mapped space. It was a research station and a holding facility both. 17 alien species worked here. There were xenobiologists like her father, security staff, medical teams, and administrative officers from the Galactic Union. There were also creatures in the containment levels. Most of them were small, samples, studied things. Drac was not small. His cage was the entire lower bay. Reinforced walls, energy barriers, 3 layers of lock systems. The station had been modified just to hold him. He took up most of the space even when he was curled, which he rarely was. Mostly he stood, or he sat with his great head low and his eyes open. He never slept. Lena had been watching for 3 months, and she had never once seen him close his eyes fully. She knew that look. She had worn it herself in the weeks after her mother died, when sleep felt like falling and falling felt like forgetting, and she was not ready to forget anything yet. So she had stayed awake instead, staring at ceilings, at walls, at nothing. Drac stared at the far wall of his cage like it owed him something. Counselor Bray had visited the station 2 weeks ago. He was a thin man with a Galactic Union badge and a voice that filled rooms without effort. He had stood at the observation window above the containment bay, looked down at Drac and said, "A biohazard, not a being. The review board will have a recommendation within 60 days. He had said it the way people said things they had already decided. Lena had been standing 3 meters behind him. He had not noticed her. She had looked down at Drac. Drac had not moved. He never moved much, but his left shoulder was always held slightly higher than his right. Stiff, like something hurt there, and he had learned to hold himself around the pain instead of against it. She had noticed that on her 4th night of watching. That night after Counselor Bray left, she had gone to her father's desk and pulled up the station medical files she was not supposed to read. She was 9 years old and she could not understand most of it, but she understood the diagram, and she understood the small notation at the bottom of the file, written by someone in the medical team 6 weeks ago and never followed up on. Foreign object detected. Left dorsal shoulder joint. Appears to be fragmented bolt, origin, military-grade projectile, pressing against primary nerve cluster. Sedation required for removal. Risk assessment, too high. Recommended action, monitor. Monitor, they were monitoring his pain. Lena had put the file down. She had gone back to corridor 7. She had pressed her forehead against the cold glass and looked down at Drac standing in his cage with his shoulder held wrong and his eyes open in the dark. She stayed there until the heating panel in the corridor clicked and groaned, and the floor got too cold even for her. Then she went to bed, but she did not sleep for a long time. Nobody on this station, she thought, was going to help him. They were too afraid of what he was to see what was happening to him. She was not afraid. She was 9 years old and small for her age, and she had already lost the person she loved most in the universe. There was not much left to be afraid of after that. She would figure something out. The med lab smelled like cold metal, and something faintly sweet that Lena had never been able to identify. Rick said it was the solution he used to store tissue samples. He said the smell was normal. Lena believed him because Rix was the most honest person on the station, even if he was not a person in the way most humans meant the word. He was Chelari, tall, thin, with 4 narrow arms and a face that had no mouth where a human would expect one. He communicated through a small translator node at his throat. When he was thinking hard, his upper 2 arms folded inward and his head tilted left. Lena had learned to wait when he did that. The answer was always worth it. She was sitting on the low stool beside his sample bench, watching him work, when she asked the question. What happens to a body that carries pain for a long time? Like a very long time, years. Rix's upper arms folded, his head tilted left. She waited. Tissue degrades around the source of the pain, he said through the translator. The body tries to protect itself by building around the wound. This causes stiffness, limited movement. Over sufficient time, secondary damage begins. Nerve pathways misfire. Toxins from damaged tissue enter the blood system. He paused. In most species, prolonged untreated pain also affects cognition, temperament. The being becomes reactive, withdrawn, sometimes aggressive without clear external cause. Lena looked at her hands. I was not asking about biology, she said. Rix was quiet for a moment, then he said, I know. He set down his sample tool and turned to face her fully. You are asking about the Vreth. She nodded. Rix had been on Crest 7 for 4 years. He had been the one to file the medical report on Drax's shoulder 6 weeks ago. He had also been the one to receive the response from the Union Medical Board, which had been 3 lines long, and had used the phrase, acceptable ongoing discomfort, in reference to a bolt pressed against a primary nerve cluster in a living being's shoulder joint. He had not slept well after reading that either. The bolt is not small, he said. 14 centimeters by my scan estimate, military grade. The entry angle suggests it struck during combat and drove inward rather than passing through. It has been there for at minimum 2 years, possibly longer. And it hurts him. Every time he moves his left foreleg, every time he breathes deeply, every time he shifts his weight. Rix's translator carried no emotion, but his upper arms folded very tightly. Yes, it hurts him. Then why hasn't anyone taken it out? Because to remove it, we must sedate him fully. A being of his mass requires a significant sedation charge, carefully calibrated, delivered without stress to avoid cardiac event. The medical team assessed the risk and declined. He paused. Counselor Bray's office supported that decision. Lena thought about the word acceptable. She thought about how someone had sat at a desk somewhere and typed that word about another being's pain and then moved on to the next file. My father could do it, she said. He's done sedation procedures on large xenofauna before. I've read his papers. Your father is a xenobiologist, not a surgeon. Rix, the bolt just needs to come out. It's not surgery, it's more like removal. My father could plan it, you could assist. The hard part is the sedation and getting close enough. Rix tilted his head left again. A long pause. The hard part, he said carefully, is that no one on this station is willing to get close enough. Lena slid off the stool. I am. She left before Rix could answer. She went back to Corridor 7. It was mid-shift and the corridor was still empty, still cold, the heating panel still broken. She did not mind. She wrapped her blanket around her shoulders and sat down with her back against the wall below the observation window and opened her book. She read aloud, quietly, a story about a girl who sailed across a frozen sea to find her brother. She had read it 4 times already. She liked it because the girl in the story was not brave in a loud way. She was just stubborn. She kept going because stopping did not occur to her. She read for an hour. On the second day, she came back and read for an hour again. On the third day, she heard a sound from below, not loud, just a shift, a weight moving. She stood up and looked through the glass. Drax's head had turned. Not toward the door of his cage, not toward the feeding hatch, toward the window, toward her. His enormous yellow eyes were looking directly up at the place where she stood with her blanket and her book and her quiet voice. She did not wave, she did not call out, she just looked back at him. Then she sat down again and kept reading. That night her father found her at his desk, going through the sedation protocol files. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He did not tell her to stop. He turned his head, she said. He heard me. Dr. Owen crossed the room slowly and sat down beside her. He looked at the files she had opened. He looked at his daughter's face, which was serious and calm, and reminded him so much of her mother that it made his chest hurt. "Show me," he said. She showed him. He read for a long time. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. Outside the porthole, the cold blue giant turned slowly in the dark. "Getting approval for a sedation procedure on a union-held subject," he said slowly, "is going to be a fight." "I know," Lena said, "but you're good at those." He looked at her. Then, despite everything, he almost smiled. The outer gate lock on the containment bay had a 7-second delay during the morning shift change. Lena had noticed it 11 days ago. The security rotation moved from night crew to day crew at 600, and in those 7 seconds while the system logged the handoff, the outer gate sat on passive hold rather than active seal. It would open to a basic station ID badge. Any badge. She had her father's spare. She had borrowed it from his coat pocket the night before, and she planned to put it back before he noticed. She was not proud of this, but she had thought about it for 11 days and she had not found another way. The corridor outside the containment bay was empty at 6:01. The day crew was still gathering their equipment in the prep room down the hall. Lena had timed that too. She had 4 minutes, maybe 5, before anyone came through. She swiped the badge. The outer gate clicked. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The outer ring of the containment bay was a narrow walkway that circled the inner barrier, a wall of thick energy-reinforced panels that separated the walkway from Drax's space. The inner barrier required a senior warden code to open. Lena had no intention of opening it. She was not reckless. She was precise. She crossed the walkway to the inner barrier and sat down on the floor, cross-legged, 3 centimeters from the panel. She could feel the faint hum of the energy barrier against her skin. She could smell the containment bay now up close. It smelled like heat and something ancient, like old stone and the air before a storm. She placed the food ration on the floor in front of her. Something sweet from last night's dinner that she had saved, still in its wrapper. Then she looked up. Drax was 12 meters away. In the space between them, he looked even larger than he did from the observation window. His scales were dark gray, almost black at the edges, with a deep red that showed only when the overhead lights caught him at an angle. His left shoulder sat higher than his right. His eyes were open. They were always open. They were looking directly at her. She did not move. She did not make herself small or try to disappear. She just looked back at him the way she always did from the window, steady, present. "I know it hurts," she said. Her voice was quiet and clear. No shaking. "Your shoulder, I know. Rix showed me the scan. The bolt has been in there for a long time and nobody came to help you, and I'm sorry about that." Drac did not move, did not make a sound. "My father is trying to get permission to remove it. There is a lot of paperwork. He hates paperwork, but he's doing it anyway." She paused. "He does things he hates when they matter." She thought for a moment she should say something more, something bigger, but she had learned in the months since her mother died that big words did not actually help. Presence helped. Sitting nearby without running away. That was the thing that helped. So she stopped talking. She just sat there with the food ration on the floor in front of her and let the hum of the barrier fill the quiet. 3 minutes passed. Drac moved. Not fast, not threatening, just a slow, immense shift of weight, one enormous forelimb moving forward, then another. He crossed the space between them with a patience that seemed deliberate. He stopped 2 meters from the inner barrier and lowered his head until it was level with the floor. His eyes were at Lena's height now. They were yellow and very old, and they looked at her the way she imagined the sea might look at something small that had climbed out onto the shore, not with hunger, with something that had no easy name. She did not move. Neither did he. Then the prep room door opened down the corridor, and someone said, "What in the—" and the alarm still did not go off because she had not breached the inner barrier, and her badge was registered. But Warden Nas's voice hit the intercom like a stone hitting water, and the morning shift crew was suddenly very awake. Lena stood up slowly. She picked up the food ration. She looked at Drac one more time. "I'll come back," she said. She turned and walked to the outer gate. It opened on her badge. She stepped through and stood in the corridor with her hands at her sides as Warden Nas came around the corner at speed, face tight, 3 crew members behind him. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at her. He looked at the outer gate, now closed and sealed again. He looked back at her. "Lena," his voice was very controlled. "What did you do?" "I sat on the floor," she said. "I didn't touch the inner barrier. I didn't breach any primary containment." "You used your father's badge without." "I know," she met his eyes. "I'm sorry about the badge. I'm not sorry about going in." Nas put a hand over his face. He stood like that for a moment. Down the hall, through the containment bay's audio feed still open on the crew panel, there was a sound. Low, steady, something between a breath and a word in a language nobody on the station fully spoke. One of the day crew, a young woman named Petra who had been on Crest 7 for 8 months, looked at the panel. Then she looked at Rix, who had appeared silently in the corridor behind them. "What was that?" she asked. Rix's upper arms folded, his head tilted left. "Old Vreth," he said quietly, a phrase roughly translated. He paused. "Small one you saw." The corridor was very quiet after that. Dr. Owen arrived at a half-run, slightly out of breath, looking at his daughter with an expression that was not quite fear and not quite relief, but was something complicated in between. Lena looked up at him. "Get me a sedation proposal," she said. "He's ready." Her father stared at her. Then he turned to Warden Nas. His voice was calm and flat and left no room for argument. "Get me a sedation proposal. We are removing that bolt." Counselor Bray stood at the head of the station council room with his arms folded and his jaw set, and he said no before Dr. Owen had finished the second sentence. "The subject is scheduled for termination review in 53 days, he said. "Performing a sedation procedure on a war-class Vreth within that window is an unnecessary risk to station personnel. The answer is no." Dr. Owen set his folder on the table. He was not a large man. He was quiet, slightly gray at the temples, with the particular steadiness of someone who had spent 20 years working with creatures that could kill him if he panicked. He did not raise his voice. He just opened the folder. "The bolt currently in the subject's shoulder is 14 centimeters long," he said. "It is a military-grade fragmentation projectile that did not exit on impact. It is lodged against the primary dorsal nerve cluster. Every movement the subject makes causes direct nerve compression." Rix's toxicology scan from last week shows secondary tissue breakdown around the site, which means inflammatory byproduct is now entering the blood system. He slid a page across the table toward Bray. "This is the original medical report filed 6 weeks ago. This is the response from the Union Medical Board." He slid another page. "This word here, acceptable, that is the word they used. I want to be very clear that in 20 years of field xenobiology, I have never used that word in reference to untreated pain in a living subject." Bray looked at the pages. "The risk assessment is mine to make," Dr. Owen said. "I am the senior xenobiologist on this station. Sedation protocol for large xenofauna is within my certification. I am not asking the union to fund the procedure. I am not asking for additional staff. I am asking for written approval to do my job." There was a silence in the room. Warden Noss sat at the far end of the table, looking at nothing in particular. Petra, who had been added to the proceedings as a crew witness, sat with her hands very still in her lap. Bray opened his mouth. Then Rix placed something on the table. It was a piece of paper, handwritten, small, slightly uneven letters because the hand that had written it was 9 years old. It showed a diagram of Drax's shoulder joint with the bolt position marked, the nerve cluster labeled, and a series of small notes along the margin about sedation weight ratios and tool approach angles. At the bottom it said, "The bolt needs to come out. He is hurting, please." Bray looked at the diagram. Then he looked at Rix. "She has been studying," Rix said simply. Bray looked back at the diagram for a long time. Something moved across his face. It was not kindness. It was closer to the expression of a man who has just realized that the room he is standing in is much more visible than he thought. He approved the procedure. 3 lines signed slid back across the table. The sedation process took most of the following day to prepare. Dr. Owen went through every calculation 4 times. Rix checked them twice more. The sedation charge had to be precise, enough to drop a being of Drax mass into a safe unconscious state without stopping his hearts, of which he had 2, and without triggering the stress response that had nearly killed 3 Union soldiers during his initial capture. The approach strategy was Lena's idea, though nobody said so officially. She had noted in her diagram that Drax always tracked her voice. He stilled when she spoke. His breath slowed. His shoulder came down slightly, the tension less. So the plan was that Lena would sit at the outer barrier and speak to him while Dr. Owen and Rix entered through the secondary access panel at the far end of the bay, sedation delivery unit between them. Warden Noss had argued against involving Lena for 20 minutes. Dr. Owen had listened to all of it. Then he had said, "She is the only reason he is calm enough for this to work." Noss had stopped arguing. The procedure began at 800. Lena sat cross-legged at the outer barrier with her blanket over her shoulders and her book open. She read. Her voice was steady. Drax's eyes stayed on her the whole time. He did not look at Dr. Owen, did not look at Rix. He watched Lena, and Lena watched him back, and she kept reading about the girl on the frozen sea who never stopped because stopping did not occur to her. The sedation charge was delivered without incident. Drax went down slowly, like a great cliff deciding to become a plane. His eyes stayed open until the last moment. They stayed on Lena. The bolt came out 14 minutes later. Rix held it up under the light. 14 centimeters. The end of it was blackened. The edges were jagged where it had fragmented on impact. There was old dried tissue on it, dark and crusted. From the years it had been sitting inside a living being and nobody had come to take it out. Rix put it in a sealed specimen container and did not say anything. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Drac breathed. Not the short, shallow breaths of a being in constant managed pain. A full, deep breath that filled his whole chest and lifted his sides and moved the air in the bay like a slow wind. Then another. Then another. Like someone who had not been able to breathe properly in years and had finally been allowed to remember how. Lena was still at the outer barrier. She had closed her book. Her hands were pressed flat on her knees. Her eyes were wet and she did not try to make them not be. As Drac's eyes opened again, slow and heavy with sedation, they found her. They always found her. She pressed her hand flat against the inner barrier panel. The hum of it ran through her palm. Drac's great claw moved, slow, deliberate. It pressed flat against the inner wall on his side. The gap between them was 3 inches of reinforced energy panel. It was the closest thing to holding a hand that either of them could manage. It was enough. 3 days after the procedure, Drac ate. Not because food was placed in the bay and he was hungry enough to move. He had been doing that for months. He ate because when the morning feeding hatch opened, he walked to it without hesitation, without holding his shoulder up, without the stiff, careful movement of a being navigating constant pain. He walked like something that had remembered what it felt like to move freely. He ate the whole portion. Then he sat near the inner barrier and was still. He was still often now, but it was a different kind of still, not the stillness of endurance, the stillness of rest. Petra had started stopping by the observation window between shifts, then 2 members of the maintenance crew, then a Galactic Union logistics officer named Bren who had been on the station for 2 years and had never once come to the lower levels. They did not say much. They just looked. Something had changed in how the station felt around that bay, and people were drawn to it without entirely knowing why. Lena noticed. She did not say anything about it, she just kept visiting. It was Rix who came to find her on the 4th day, his upper arms folded, his head tilted left at the most extreme angle she had ever seen. "I need to tell you something," he said, "about the sounds Drac makes at night." She followed him to the med-lab. He pulled up the audio logs from the past 3 nights, isolating low frequencies the standard monitoring system had not flagged. He played them for her. They were deep, slow, rhythmic sounds, almost like words. "I speak fragments of old Vreth," he said. "What I know is limited, but this phrase," he pointed to a waveform pattern that repeated 3 times per night, always at the same depth and cadence. "I recognize this." "What does it mean?" Rix was quiet for a moment. The Vreth are a very old species, older than most of the Union's founding members. Their culture has concepts that do not translate cleanly, but this phrase Drethkal, it is a life oath, ancient, sacred, irrevocable. He paused. "It means, as closely as I can translate, I am the shield of the one who saw my wound." Lena sat very still. "He has been saying it every night," Rix said, "since the procedure, 3 times in the deep part of the night, always in the direction of your quarters." Outside the mid-lab porthole, the gas giant turned. Lena thought about a being who had carried pain for years in silence, surrounded by people who were afraid of him or wanted to use him, or had simply decided he was not worth the trouble. She thought about what it must mean to that being when something small and quiet sat down on the floor nearby and said, "I know it hurts. I'm sorry." She thought she understood the oath. She did not have time to say so, because that afternoon the station received a message from the Galactic Union Administrative Office, and within 2 hours Counselor Bray's shuttle was docking at the upper bay. He had brought people with him this time, not aides, security personnel, 6 of them in Union enforcement gray with the kind of equipment that was not used for research stations. Dr. Owen found out from Petra, who had seen the manifest. He went directly to the council room. Lena followed him and stood outside the door. She could not hear everything, but she heard enough. The termination review had been moved forward, 37 days forward, effective in 48 hours. She heard her father's voice go flat and sharp, in the way it did when he was very angry, and keeping it very controlled. She heard Bray's voice say, "A war dragon in life debt to a human child is a political liability." Those were his exact words. She memorized them. She went back to Corridor 7. She sat under the observation window. She did not have her book, she just sat. Below, Drac was standing near the inner barrier. He was looking up at the window. He was always looking when she came. She did not know how he knew, but he always knew. She pressed her hand against the cold glass. He pressed his claw against the inner wall below. They stayed like that for a long time. That night something happened that nobody had planned and nobody could have predicted, because nobody on the station had fully understood what a Vreth life oath meant in practice until it happened. Drac broke the inner lock. Not the outer gate, not the full containment seal, just the inner lock, the one between the containment space and the outer ring walkway, which he had never touched in all the months he had been held there. He broke it with a single, precise pressure applied to the weakest join point, the one Warden Noss would later say a structural engineer would have needed a schematic to find. He did not leave the containment bay. He moved into the outer ring and positioned himself at the end of the corridor closest to Lena's quarters on the other side of the outer gate, and he sat down. The alarms went off. The night crew scrambled. Noss arrived in 4 minutes with a full response team and stood at the end of the corridor looking at an ancient war dragon who was not attacking, not moving, not threatening anyone. Just sitting, between the docking bay where Bray's security team had berthed their shuttle and the residential corridor where Lena slept. Noss stood very still for a long moment. He looked at Drac. He looked at the direction of the docking bay. He looked back at Drac. Then he got on the comm and woke up Dr. Owen. "Your dragon," he said, and his voice was strange, "has picked a side." Nobody slept. The corridor lights were on full. The night crew stood back near the junction. Drac filled the passage between them and the residential wing like a wall that had decided to breathe. His eyes were open. His shoulder, for the first time in years, was level. Bray's security team had come from the docking bay at the first alarm. Now they stood at the far end of the corridor in a line, equipment raised, watching the dragon watch them back. Nobody had given an order. Nobody seemed to want to be the first to give one. Then a door opened. Lena came out of her quarters in her sleep clothes and bare feet. Her hair was loose. She walked down the corridor toward Drac without hurrying, without looking at the security team, without looking at anyone except the great dark shape ahead of her. She stopped beside him. She put her hand on his foreleg. It was like putting her hand on the side of a building. He did not move. She turned and looked at the security team. "He has done nothing wrong," she said. Her voice was small and perfectly clear. "He moved to this corridor. He has not threatened anyone. He has not attacked anything. He is just standing here." One of the security officers looked at Bray, who had arrived at the junction. Bray's face was tight. He looked at the girl. He looked at the dragon. He looked at the 6 armed officers and the readings on their equipment, and the fact that every camera on this level was running and had been running since the first alarm. He looked at Rix, who had appeared very quietly beside Dr. Owen, holding a data tablet. "I have taken the liberty," Rix said in his flat translator voice, "of transmitting the full medical record of subject Vreth 9 to 3 external news relay stations. The transmission includes the original incident report, the Union Medical Board's response using the phrase acceptable ongoing discomfort, and the toxicology results from last week." He paused. "The relay stations began receiving it approximately 6 minutes ago." Bray went very still. "The timing of the current termination order," Rix continued, "appears in the record as occurring 4 days after a successful removal procedure. the procedure which the same Union Medical Board had previously declined to authorize. Another pause. I thought transparency was important. Dr. Owen stepped forward. He was not loud. He was never loud. But he stood in the middle of that corridor like a man who had decided very clearly where he was, and said, "This station operates under Galactic Union Charter, which includes the provision that all living subjects held under Union authority are owed basic care. We provided that care. If the Union wants to make a case in public that providing care to a living being is grounds for accelerating its termination, I am happy to have that conversation on the record." Warden Noss walked out of the side corridor and stood next to Dr. Owen. He did not say anything. He just stood there. Petra came out a moment later and stood beside Noss. Then Bren, the logistics officer who had never come to the lower levels before last week, appeared at the back of the group and stood there too. Bray looked at all of them. He looked at the cameras. He looked at the dragon standing quietly in the corridor with a 9-year-old girl's hand resting on his leg. He ordered the security team to stand down. He did not look at Lena as he walked past her. He did not look at Drac. He walked to the docking bay and he did not come back to the residential level again. His shuttle left 6 hours later. 3 weeks after that, a formal reclassification order came through from the Galactic Union Administrative Office. Subject Vreth 9 was reclassified as a protected ward of Outpost Crest 7 pending full review. It was a legal status so rarely used that Rix had to pull an archive file to find the original charter language. The review process, he noted, had no fixed end date. The containment bay was restructured over the following month. Still secure, still responsible, but larger, with access to the station's lower atmospheric ring, where the outer panels could be opened and the cold, clean air of near space came in, and something that had been locked in the dark for a long time could finally look at the stars. Lena was there the first time the panels opened. She sat on the floor of the outer ring with her back against the barrier, her book in her lap, and she watched Drac stand in the open air and lift his head and breathe. He breathed for a long time. Dr. Owen watched from the doorway. He watched his daughter sitting at the base of an ancient war dragon like it was the most natural thing in the universe. He thought about her standing in a corridor in her bare feet telling armed officers that the creature behind her had done nothing wrong. He thought about how she had never once asked whether it was safe. She had only ever asked whether it was right. Her mother had been like that too, that same quiet certainty, that same refusal to walk past something that needed to be seen. He did not wipe his eyes, he just stood there. After a while, Lena opened her book and began to read aloud. The story about the girl on the frozen sea. She had read it many times. She did not mind. Some stories were worth coming back to. Drac settled near her, slow and enormous, and closed his eyes. It was the first time she had ever seen him close his eyes. She kept reading. She did not stop until he was asleep. Across the galaxy, beings feared the Vreth war dragons. They feared their fire and their age and the long memory that made them hold grudges across generations. They told stories about their wrath and their power, and the wars they had started and ended. They did not know that the oldest of them, the most scarred, the one who had been locked in the dark and left to hurt in silence, had given his oath to a small human girl who noticed that he never slept. Humanity had sent many things to the stars: ships, soldiers, scientists, treaties and weapons and flags, but it was a child with a blanket and a book and the quiet, stubborn belief that pain deserved an answer who won the loyalty of a dragon. She had not done it with strength. She had done it by sitting down on a cold floor and saying, "I see you. I know it hurts. I'm here." Sometimes that is the most powerful thing in the universe.